We are joined today. We have really a very interesting program. I think we've all been hearing in the news the plight of women in Afghanistan. We have an expert with us, Annie Pforzheimer, who will be speaking on the human rights of women in Afghanistan. I'm gonna leave her resume for discussion or introduction by Amy, so I won't say how wonderful she is, and how she is really the best person for us to be hearing this discussion from. Um, in terms of women, this is really a very, I think for all of us, very difficult topic. Afghanistan ranks at the bottom of human rights for women. Um, it is on an index of the Women, Peace, and Security Index. It is 117. It's the 117th of 107. Oh, 177th of 177. So at the very bottom. I think the questions are, why are women and their rights so minimized? Why should we care in the US and as women? And what can be done? So I'm going to turn over to Amy, who will introduce her. She will speak for about 35 minutes, and then we will continue with questions from our panelists and also from you, our audience. Please enter your questions into the chat so we can read them to our speaker. As you know, our program is being archived, recorded and archived. It is available on the Chappaqua Library website. Go to the library website under Events and Foreign Policy. And now let me turn our program over to Amy.
Great. Thank you, June, for setting the scene for us and laying out some of the key questions. I was delighted that Annie Pforzheimer agreed to join us today, and I'll keep my introduction fairly brief so that most of the time is for our intended topic of the day. But Annie Pforzheimer is a retired U.S. Department of State career diplomat with the rank of Minister Counselor. Annie is currently a senior non-resident associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I'm thrilled that she's a colleague of mine at Pace University, where she teaches a course on diplomacy, and she's also an adjunct professor at the City University of New York. She is a tireless human rights advocate and foreign policy commentator. She's a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and serves as board chair for Women for Afghanistan, a board chair for Women for Afghan Women, a social service agency in the United States and Afghanistan. She's also a board member of the Board of Visitors for the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation and the Leadership Circle of Foreign Policy for America, a political action group. Ms. Pforzheimer is the author of numerous articles and op-eds on Afghanistan policy and co-author of studies and articles on issues relating to international organized crime and fentanyl. Her 30-year diplomatic career focused on security, rule of law, and human rights policy. She was the acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Afghanistan and Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Office Director for UN Peacekeeping and Sanctions, and head of the 700 million Security Assistance Program in Mexico, as well as the lead human rights officer in Turkey and South Africa, and director at the National Security Council regarding Central American migration. Ms. Pforzheimer is a graduate of Harvard University with a master's degree in national security studies from the National Defense University. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Amy. First of all, we're colleagues, but also Amy is my supervisor. So we'll just make that one clear. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you about Afghanistan, an issue obviously close to my heart, but I think that should be close to all of ours. The question that was posed just now of why should we care is a really personal one. I can't possibly answer it, for others, but I can tell you why I care. That it is part of a massive abrogation of rights of women that is not just confined to Afghanistan, but finds its extreme form there. And something that I think we should be concerned about, that if it continues, it serves as a beacon to misogynists all over the world, as well as extremists, who look at this as an example of what they would do if they also controlled an entire country. I also believe we should care because the US spent a lot of time and military might, not wisely, in Afghanistan and made a lot of promises while we were there. And so if our word is to mean something, then we should be caring what happened to the people that we left behind. I think I want to start with a little level setting, as my military colleagues would say, in terms of, Afghanistan. I know you are a well-informed group, but I will speed through a little orientation, starting with, the favorite of teachers everywhere, which is a map. I think that sometimes it's good just to get a sense of where Afghanistan is physically. It is a landlocked nation. It is surrounded by countries that actually do not have Afghanistan's best interests at heart for geopolitical reasons. And one of the interesting things about Afghanistan is how it was part of the great game. In other words, that above Afghanistan to the north was sort of the Russian Empire, as you can see all the stands, the Central Asian nations. To the east was the Mughal Empire, the Indian Empire, and the British, who were part of India, Pakistan. And then to the west was the Persian Empire. And so Afghanistan has always been a sort of a crossroads, or a piece to be fought over in the great game. And all of it complicated by the fact that it doesn't have its own port, and that it does rely on its neighbors for access to the sea and to other, to markets. And of course, just to complicate things even further, Afghanistan even has a tiny border with China. So there's an interest that China has in the disposition of Afghanistan as far as its security and also its considerable minerals. Afghanistan is poor. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Afghanistan is poor. It is mountainous. It has not really developed major industries in its economy. It has a lot of dependency, even now, on subsistence agriculture. It's also heterogeneous in its population. There are different groups that would refer to themselves as tribes that are ethnic or religious, or kind of a combination of linguistic distinctions, one from the other. The main four are Hazara, Uzbek, Tajik, and Pashtun. I could tell you percentages of each, but I would be lying because there's no really reliable numbers. The last time that Afghanistan was peaceful enough to have a census was in the 1970s. And there are millions of Afghans who are living outside the country in an uncertain status as refugees. There are Sunni and Shia, mainly Sunni, 99 point something percent Muslim population. There was one Afghan Jew who lived there and has just very recently left. When I served at the embassy, I met him, hosted him for, I think, a Seder. But there used to be a Jewish community. There was a more vibrant Sikh community. Even Buddhism had its roots in Afghanistan as well. the war has, that we all know about, the 20 years of US engagement, is only a percentage of the conflicts that have beset Afghanistan in the 20th and now 21st century. Starting essentially in the 1970s, 1975, there was a coup, and then 1979, an invasion by the Soviet Union. And at that point, after the Soviet Union invasion, the US became involved in sort of a proxy fight where they were funding some of the fighters there, which in turn led to an even more extremist group that took power. So the Soviets left in 1989, the government that they left behind fell a few years later. A civil war broke out, and then the Taliban took over for the first time in 1996. And from 1996 to 2001, they were resisted in the end just by one small group in one province, and they performed this governance of extremes, barring girls from school, barring women from all activities. And then we all know what happened in September 11th, 2001. The US entered Afghanistan a month after 9/11 and was there for 20 years, leaving in August of 2021. I can definitely answer more questions, but I'm going to leave it there in terms of history. The current situation. On the political side, there is a chokehold by the Taliban authorities, who are not a government, are not recognized as such. So I would refer to them, and the UN refers to them, as the de facto authorities. They have a chokehold on political power. They believe that their power is divine, that they receive authorization from God, that having beaten the United States and the NATO coalition is further proof. And so it's not power that comes from some kind of popular will. And if God wants them to take steps that the population disagrees with, in that equation, God wins. And if the things they do cause suffering among the population, they are considering that to be the will of God. They have issued over 100 decrees that restrict human rights for really everyone, but the brunt has been borne by women and girls. And we'll go a little bit more into that in a minute. But their restrictions are such that many men are now no longer allowed to practice their own religion or personal lives with freedom. It isn't just women. There's a single leader who is basically surrounded by a council, and they issue these decrees. There's no true representative body that is authorizing them or passing laws. The economic side is dire. The country was quite dependent on foreign assistance, but it was improving economically. However, as of the Taliban takeover, they've been cut off from all assistance that is not basic humanitarian, sort of just to keep you going kind of assistance. The World Bank has a few projects which it is working on with the authorization of the US and others, but by and large, there is no development assistance. There's no money that's going directly to the Taliban authorities. The humanitarian assistance is administered by the United Nations and private entities. Essentially, the Taliban's behavior is cutting themselves off from both assistance and direct investment. Just to name one reason why only sort of the wildest investors would go there, there really is no rule of law. If you invested your money in anything, a factory, you don't know if tomorrow the supreme leader will decide that in fact that factory should go to, a truer believer than you. There's no such thing as a way to sue a court and get your money back. There's widespread unemployment, widespread despair. There are mitigation, to use a very technical UN-ish term, mitigation strategies, which involve leaving the country, borrowing money, selling your girl, and depending on remittances from those family members who have left and are employed. And in the midst of all of this, the Taliban have banned the production of opium, which, to be perfectly honest, was an economic lifeline to hundreds of thousands of Afghans. Socially, it was always a conservative society. It is erroneous to say that under the republic, under the government that the US supported, that women were able to do everything. Some women had more rights, and many women were represented in the government and in key aspects of society, but it was a very, very conservative place. It is even more so. The culture that the Taliban are encouraging is one in which women are unable to have a public role, and even within their homes, they are constrained. It is being discussed whether women should be forbidden to have smartphones. And the only people who can impose that rule are fathers and brothers. Women who want to leave the house at this point basically can only leave with a family member, a male family member escorting her. So to talk more about women's rights, these decrees have piled up one after the other. They began days after the Taliban took power. They are continuing. The ones that just recently hit the media was a decree banning women from medical education. Now, obviously, if you can imagine this worldview, women have already been banned from going to male doctors. So now they are banning the education of those who would become female doctors. There's no ability for girls to go to school after 6th grade. They cannot work in the government. They can't go anywhere without their male escort family members called a maharam. That would be anyone in your family. I think I want my speakers to imagine this, that, if you have to go to the store, or if you have an acute pain and you're pregnant, you'd better have a male family member over the age of 12 who is doing nothing else but can escort you anywhere that you think you want to go. You can't get in a taxi. The taxi drivers have been instructed not to take you unless you have that male family member. They've made women quit jobs and send that male family member instead, whether or not that person has any kind of qualification. Women can't talk in public beyond an exchange with a shopkeeper, and they can't even go to a park. They're not allowed to go to a big public park with their family, with their male family member. They may not go and sit in the open air and have a picnic. So the rules are large and small, and I think that they are very similar in nature to apartheid. To be totally provocative, I would say they remind me of the Nuremberg laws, because they are governing a separateness and a punitive, nature of taking one part of the population and erasing them. The punishment for violating these laws is grotesque. In some cases, young women have been arrested for having an improper headscarf. Oh, and all of this, if they're outside, they are 100% covered facial head to toe. Improper hijab, people have been taken to jail, and in jail there are very credible allegations of rape. This is beyond the tragedy that is for the individual. It is also almost a sort of death sentence for the family. This is a dishonor of grave proportions for everybody. And family members essentially are regulating their women, not because they hate them, but because they are afraid for them. So this does, according to all the international, assessments and Afghan assessments and Afghan legal scholars, this is gender persecution, and the term gender apartheid has been coined to refer to this situation. And it is not yet a crime against humanity in international law, but there is an effort underway to create it as a crime. What can be done? As Amy knows, one of the things that I teach is, the toolkit. What are the actual international tools for doing anything? And when we talk about grave human rights violations happening in another country, and if you take any kind of military tool off the table, which I think we all can agree is the case, your tools are weak. That is simply the way that the international system is designed and that states protect themselves. So there are some legal tools, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, where cases have been brought against Afghanistan, particularly against the Taliban. As I mentioned, we have the tool of creating gender apartheid as a crime against humanity. That doesn't do anything, help anybody immediately, but it has a pretty powerful sort of social, soft power and political impact. There is the policy of non-recognition. The Taliban have been in power for 3 years, but they are not recognized. And some of us who work in this field feel very strongly that the non-recognition policy is the basis on which any kind of positive change has to rest. If the Taliban were recognized, then I think that Afghan activists would really be too disheartened and disempowered to move forward. And I just want to point out, as simply an American, if the Taliban were recognized, how would we all react to a Talib standing at the podium during the UN General Assembly, issuing a speech to the world regarding the need to keep women in the spot that the Taliban have figured out is the right one, and being an example to, extremists all over the world who believe the same thing. There are other tools such as economic sanctions, many of which are in place with a carve out to allow the delivery of humanitarian assistance. There is the asylum for those who leave. The EU has actually issued, not the whole EU, but members of the EU have issued legal rulings that essentially state that if you are a woman from Afghanistan who is in one of these countries, you are legally justified as an asylee simply by being a woman from Afghanistan. There are other tools that are incentives to the Taliban. Those have been tried and they have been extraordinarily unsuccessful. And then finally, there's a tool of trying to empower the many, many, many Afghans who oppose Taliban rule. That doesn't mean arming an opposition, although there is an armed opposition, and there are some who are trying to potentially get the US to do this or to look kindly on the armed opposition. But there are many unarmed people who are trying very hard to come together. And I think that much more can be done to provide a structure for the opposition to meet with each other, to come up with a vision of a way forward, and to be empowered by the international community, because that opposition group is a much more true representative, a more legitimate representative of the people of Afghanistan than the ones who have seized power and who are acting in their name. I will leave it there because I would really like to hear what your questions are. Thank you.
Great. Annie, thank you. I mean, it's so beyond heartbreaking that I think it's hard sometimes to even kind of wrap my head around where do you go from here. I have a couple of questions, but I don't want to monopolize. So maybe I'll start with two. My first question is going back to your discussion about gender apartheid and including gender apartheid in the definition of crimes against humanity. And I wonder really what the substance could be of having that additional legal tool. I mean, the sanctions against Afghanistan right now are sweeping, right? There's like short of what I would imagine as maybe greater coordination from other Muslim states. I don't know if the Gulf states, like if the Taliban have any connections to legitimate states in the international community, like what are really the international implications of adding kind of one more legal tool to the toolbox? I'm just not kind of seeing where that would take us. Maybe we'll start with that question.
Sure. I can talk a little more if people would like about the international relations that the Taliban are trying to have. There are a number of states who, depends on your definition of legitimate, et cetera, but there are quite a few states who are perfectly happy to have dealings with them, have business dealings with them. And so they are receiving some oxygen from that. China, Russia, Central Asian states, UAE, Qatar. There are countries that are accepting Taliban diplomats. Nobody has completely crossed over to full recognition, but China's foreign minister visited. So they're breaking out in some respects because they have a strategic position and they have minerals that people want, and because on some level, even countries like India want to have a presence in country just to understand what's happening. Gender apartheid, all the legal tools are important on one level of accountability. But to me, the most important part is that I think it's imperative to prevent the Taliban from getting the seat of Afghanistan at the UN. And the only country that essentially got unseated was South Africa for apartheid in the 1970s. So all kinds of terrible governments take their country's seats. I think it's important to prevent the Taliban from doing that from Afghanistan. And I also think that calling it what it is important to just continue to advocate for changes to the situation on the ground.
All right, I'm going to ask one more question and then see who on the board has questions, and I see that there are a number in the chat. I wonder if you could talk maybe specifically about Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban, because it felt to me that the US has such a complicated relationship with Pakistan, and I'm wondering whether that's just fallen off it feels a little as if that has fallen off the US's either radar screen or priority list. So what is Pakistan's relationship right now to the Taliban? And, you know, how does the US play into that dynamic?
For the time that the US had troops in the country, if we go back to my map, Pakistan was playing a role of allowing US forces and material to enter the country. It was a strategic requirement to essentially stay on good terms with Pakistan because there was really no other way to bring things in and out of the country in bulk. So, ironically, with the end of the war came the end of that requirement to work as closely with Pakistan as we had. Um, Also, very ironically, Pakistan having hosted Taliban in country, provided a safe haven for Taliban fighters, medical attention, funding, essentially, on the one hand, taking money from the U.S. to bring material across the country, and on the other, continuing the war by supporting the Taliban. Pakistan got what it thought it wanted and is actually not all that happy because Taliban are now supporting, in reverse, anti-Pakistan insurgency, known by initials TPP, and the Pakistani government is shocked to learn that in fact there is a safe haven next door for a group that is really violent and has been attacking targets inside Pakistan. The U.S. is a little bit sort of more hands off than it was before because it can be, and dealing with Pakistan is complicated. Their politics are beyond complex. And so the US has, with respect to Afghanistan and Pakistan, has advocated for the safety of Afghans who are awaiting repatriation to the United States, many of whom are inside Pakistan. Pakistan is busy kicking Afghans out who have nowhere to go. And the US has, I think, essentially slightly walked away from this part of the world, taken together.
Would any of my colleagues, Naomi, why don't you go next?
Annie, thank you. How many times a day do you bang your head against the wall?
Many.
Another feeling, okay. Is there any underground educational system is too organized a word? Any underground efforts or reality for girls to get educated?
People are resilient, people are inventive. You hear stories, and I know of certain types of underground education that exists. I even heard a nice story about a local imam in a small village who told the Taliban there that, oh, all of these girls are my nieces, and that's why they come to my house every day to talk about things. It's nothing. I'm sorry, but it's nothing. In the context of an environment where girls have cell phones slapped out of their hands by their brothers, or where an education will lead you exactly nowhere, where nothing is accredited, you can learn and learn, but you will have nothing to do with it. Where you can be beaten by anybody in your family, by anybody on the street, if your scarf is crooked. So, on the one hand, I applaud all those who are taking part in encouraging education because mental health is dire for girls. But on the other, I truly want to say, in the context of what they're suffering, it's just nothing compared to what they need.
And hearing what you've said about medical expertise, is there really any for girls and women?
Well, there are now educated girls and women in the medical field, but there won't be.
So just Annie, to clarify, so if if a woman needs medical care right now, they must go to a woman medical provider. And since the pipeline for training new caregivers, you're saying, has now been completely shut off, there will be a time where, in theory, women are not allowed to receive medical care?
Correct.
And will the women currently practicing be allocated or able to get any supplies?
I don't know. A lot of the medical infrastructure is still being internationally supported.
Hmm.
I would say
Tyler,
thank you.
Amy,
Tyler, why don't you go next, and then June?
all right.
Yes, Amy, looking at the barriers to women's participation in the economy, is there any way with the agreement or participation of a male that a woman could, say, work in a store or do anything productive that would earn her any money? Again, given the overall, ability of a male to kind of control the situation.
Yeah, thank you. The private sector is one area where the decrees have not been as draconian, and there are women who do participate in the private sector. But even though they haven't been explicitly prohibited from doing that, they do so within that bigger context of, you can't get in a taxi or you can't talk to people. So as you note, it's all about people bringing their male family member here, there, and everywhere in order to earn a living. But there are a lot of women who are widows from the, many, many years of war who don't have necessarily a male family member who can provide that for them.
Is there any murdering of newborn female babies?
I'm so sorry. Did-
Is there any rate of murder for newborn baby girls?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. June, you had a question, and then Peter.
Yeah, I have some questions that are coming in from the chat. So I think a very fundamental question that is being asked is, what is the basis for the Taliban's treatment of women? So the religious or the basis that all of this is coming from, that they are supporting themselves with in justifying these actions.
Well, I think it's a couple of things. Of course, other Muslim majority countries, governments, something called the Organization of Islamic Conference, which is an association of Muslim majority countries. All kinds of countries, religious scholars have made it extraordinarily clear that, especially the education ban, let's say, is completely against the tenets of Islam as they understand it. And so even though the Taliban might start by saying this is Islamic, it is refuted over and over again. It doesn't seem to matter because it becomes a personal interpretation of the supreme leader. There's also a side of it that's a little bit tribal is the term that would be used there. It's something called Pashtunwali, which is a kind of a mix of very old-fashioned traditions and religion and culture where a woman is an extension of the family's honor. And so her role in the world has to be significantly constrained, or it's a stain on the family. I think there's another side of it that's a little bit political. The Islamic State is present in Afghanistan, this terrorist group, which we read about it being in Syria and Iraq, etc. And they are even more extreme. And so the Taliban is taking some steps in order to keep its fighters who brought it to power from defecting to the even more extreme Islamic State. And they are doing what they do in order to keep their coalition together. Otherwise, they're quite concerned that they will splinter in the face of pretty overwhelming numbers of Afghans who don't favor their policies.
I think
Should we
there
let
was,
Peter ask his question, and then June, I'll let you kind of
Okay.
run the chat. Is that okay?
sure, that's fine.
Yeah, I'll be quick. First, I think you're probably aware, I just want to give a shout out for the number of refugee welcoming organizations right in Westchester who've been doing a great job with Afghan refugees and have some just sterling young women who are being very successful in so many ways. My questions come back to your point about the toolkit, and you gave some support for the notion of aiding the opposition. And I read that there are some Afghans who argue for more engagement by outsiders, not recognition of the Taliban, and that in some way could really help the Taliban change in spite of itself. Is that a reasonable hope or not?
No, it is not a reasonable hope. It's absolutely a point of view that had more traction, a couple years ago. And over time, the number of advocates has dwindled because it's been attempted. And it is the case that the Taliban will pocket whatever they get in terms of international recognition or actual benefits and give nothing. And they have met with the UN, gotten everything they wanted. The most recent example people might use is in July, there was a meeting with the UN and the Taliban, and according to the Taliban's wishes, Afghan opposition was not included in this meeting. Human rights was not on the agenda. And then 1 month later, they passed a law. They approved a law that was the draconian accumulation of all of the decrees, called the Law on the Protection of Virtue and Prosecution of Vice. So that was in August after the July meeting. So of course, it's a matter of great debate. And you never know with diplomacy, but I think, of course, I'm pretty firmly in the anti-engagement camp, as you can tell, but I think that the engagement side has run out of steam because what they have advocated for has not worked.
Thank you.
In your
There, I
estimation,
had one
what would work?
question. Oh, go ahead, Jim.
In your estimation, what would help? Anything?
Annie, I think Naomi's saying, so what would help? And I think it goes back to your point about legal tools and working with the opposition outside of Afghanistan. I think it feels so small in comparison to the harms, which feel so enormous.
Agree.
Thank you.
Is there
Very-
any, quick question, is there any organized opposition within Afghanistan?
Not really, no. One of the former presidents and former, basically, vice president stayed. They are kind of prisoners in their homes. They're not being badly treated, but they're there. There are political opposition is pretty much not there. Some people may oppose different decrees, but they have cracked down. There are male professors who protested women being taken out of universities, and they were arrested. People who were in the former government's security forces have been disappeared and killed. So being in the opposition, women who protest, who simply hold up a sign, have been jailed and, as I mentioned, tortured. They are swift in their repression. So forming an opposition of any kind, even criticizing them. The media has just been told that they can't have talk shows of any kind. They need to have things that are pre-recorded and not live because they don't want any criticism in the media.
Thank you. So a couple of questions. I guess, what is the percentage, or how do you look at the infiltration of the Taliban on sort of, local life? Are there a number of Taliban in each community, and they report people who they see are objecting, or so what is that sort of their structure that they are able to control such kinds of power?
They have a pretty formidable, structure that goes all the way down to a local level. I think they have some fellow travelers who help. But the government that they took is a highly centralized one. And that's something of great dispute, I think, for the going forward. But the security forces are centrally controlled, education is centrally controlled, any kind of policing, etc. So they have people that they can appoint all the way down to the local levels, and yes, who have their loyalty back up to the center.
Okay, and then coming from, I think, our audience, one is we have been talking about groups who help to settle. One is Open Arms for Refugees. All of these organizations are looking for volunteers. So if anyone is interested, they would be delighted to be
Please do.
contacted and connect you. Also, there's an organization that the one of the questions is coming in is called Too Young to Wed, and they want to know if this is an effective organization.
Sure. Too Young to Wed. I'm good friends with the executive director, and it's there in Northern Westchester. But is a very good organization, and they are working with. They try to work with families to encourage them not to give their daughters in marriage, as children. And with the economic restrictions on families, the fact that girls can't go and, grow up, get education, and get jobs, their value is simply being diminished to selling them in marriage. So Too Young to Wed's work is, it's a little constrained, but they're clever and they work as hard as they can, basically to support families. They're not portraying themselves as being political. They're supporting families so that those families in turn do not have to give their daughters away.
June, can I ask a question? And it comes from, there's a comment in the chat that the Taliban doesn't represent true Islam. And I have to feel that in the UN, there are a number of Muslim countries who would agree with that statement wholeheartedly. So is there an internal discussion at the UN among Islamic states about how to maybe have a for lack of a better word, sort of pressure campaign on the
Yeah.
Taliban, or no? Because
No,
there's
yes,
just disagreement. Oh,
it's been happening. We've had the U.S. had a special envoy for human rights, a woman named Rina Amiri, herself Afghan American, and Rina's been racking up air miles on flights around the world. Indonesia, for example, Malaysia. Egypt, there are so many countries who have tried, and that Organization of Islamic Conference, it's an organization that has sent scholars to Afghanistan. They have absolutely made the case that this is not how Islam should be interpreted. The Taliban don't care. They think of those people as apostates, as false, believers, and so they absolutely don't respond to any of that. That's just the way that they have been from the start.
Another question is also sponsoring people inside Afghanistan unless they have an approved SIV case. And is it possible to sponsor Afghan refugees that are languishing in Pakistan, Malaysia, and elsewhere?
That is a great question. Maybe I can share some of the websites with you afterwards. Welcome US, which it sounds like many people are familiar with. The person has to be on some kind of path, SIV or other, but there really are thousands of people who might fit that category and who are waiting in a very difficult situation, mainly Pakistan, also Iran, but harder for Americans to reach there. And it would be wonderful and generous to consider ways to support them. You know, I can't say really enough good things about the Afghans that I know and have worked with, who are pretty tremendous human beings and who have been through convulsions, not of their making. You know, one of my friends who is here now, her mother was a refugee, and in, you know, the first time around, and my friend who had a good job used to buy things for the house. And she said, my mother used to get mad at me for buying, you know, carpet or curtains or other things. And then her mother is now a refugee for the second time, and they came out with a suitcase. And my friend said, oh, I understand now. You know, you don't buy things for your house.
And what about, we talked a little bit about Pakistan, and Iran, the other border countries, have they closed their borders, or is there a stream of people, you know, kind of looking for any exit from Afghanistan?
They've essentially closed their borders. And Tajikistan, which is one of the very few countries that is actively anti-Taliban, they've led the idea of a security cordon around the country. Afghanistan is a bit cursed by this geography. It is possible to bottle people up in it. And Pakistan and Iran still accept Afghans without that much formality, but the other countries around them do not.
And I would imagine, although I don't know if I'm right, that for Afghans outside of Kabul, particularly, would ordinary Afghans have documents? Would they have a birth certificate and a passport? I mean, being a
No,
refugee requires papers.
yeah, the Taliban have made a whole lot of money off of this misery by selling a lot of passports. They are now in control of the passport issuance agency. Although weirdly enough, they issue passports that were created by the former government. But in any event, they are charging a lot of money, and a lot of Afghans, millions really, are getting their passports in order to leave.
So the Taliban is not closing people in. It's just that it's hard to find a place that is open.
Yeah, Afghans have sort of the lowest mobility in the world of places that they're allowed to go. They also, I mean, they're, as was mentioned, at the lowest index of women's rights. They are also at the lowest index of mobility.
June, any other questions that you're seeing in the chat?
There's just a comment that it says HHR is a private sponsorship organization. The oversight organization is Welcome Corps. And it's available to guide volunteer teams through the application and resettlement process.
You know, HHR is Hearts and Homes for Refugees.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, Welcome Corps is tremendous.
I know that there are religious institutions, churches and synagogues that have sponsored families. I know someone who's doing that, and are delighted to do it and love the people that they're helping and would do more if they could. So if you try and leave Afghanistan, there's no penalty, that they're not stopping you. What if somebody manages to leave? Are the family members left behind face any repercussions?
Mostly no. I think that the worst treatment has been for family members of former soldiers,
Right. Mhm.
and by and large, the Taliban are not preventing people from leaving. Um, it represents for them, one fewer.
Easy. Right.
Yeah, it's a fewer critics and more remittances.
Right. Yeah.
What happens to people who are interested? How easy is it to come to the United States?
It's extraordinarily difficult. If the person was in a role, a job that had something to do with the US, then it becomes possible. But most of those people have been identified by now. I'm on the board of this agency, Women for Afghan Women. We had hundreds of staff. Those people received a designation as possible refugees. And so they're the kind of people who could be allowed in either through just a US government program, which exists to bring people out, or through Welcome Corps, which can pick people and move them. But they have to be designated first. Many, many, many Afghans would like to leave. They would like to come to the US, but they have no path.
Right. And I would imagine that all of this may change further after January 20th.
Agree. There's certainly a lot of work being done. There are coalitions of groups, human rights, humanitarian, and veterans groups who have been working for 3.5 years on how to streamline this process, how to make it work, and over time have become pretty great at understanding the levers and have worked hard with Congress. So whoever is in the White House, it makes a difference, but also the congressional side of it has been really important. And we have champions in Congress who see the point. And the incoming National Security Advisor, Michael Waltz, Congressman Waltz, is actually somebody who has done good work on Afghanistan in the past, calling attention to human rights issues and supporting refugees.
Great. That's good to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Peter, maybe the last question for the day.
I wanted to come back to your point about the UN. I just saw a report that came out from the Security Council Sanctions Committee this past week, where a number of countries, including Iran, have been very critical of the Taliban, not only on their treatment of women, but also seeing the growing connection with narcotics trade and terrorism. Can you comment on that?
Absolutely. It's extraordinary, it's sort of the one thing that the US and Iran and Russia and others have in common is growing concern about how unstable the Taliban's rule is making the country. There are these sanctions in place that were just a portion of the sanctions were just renewed on Friday. Unanimous Security Council support. I mean, you don't find that very frequently, but they feel that way about these sanctions. The Taliban are allowing Al Qaeda, the Islamic State, and many, many other groups safe haven inside the country. This is dangerous for everybody, and particularly its neighbors. So the neighbors of Afghanistan are not pleased with the way the Taliban is running the country. And the UN is sort of the only format where all of this concern can come together in a way that can possibly get the Taliban's attention. They don't care what the US says. They've heard it before. They don't care what the Muslim majority countries say. They heard that before. But when the entire UN speaks with one voice and renews sanctions, for example, then they have to pay attention. And so the only path forward is to continue making the case that this is unsustainable, unjust, and a real violation of the basic values of the United Nations.
Thank you.
I just want to mention that Annie, I sent you a note. If you would send me the list of the organizations, I could send it out to everyone.
Sure.
Thank you.
So, Amy, are we ready to conclude?
Yeah, I think so. So Annie, thank you for joining us today. Very difficult to hear this update, but I really appreciate some of the very specific drilling down on the information you provided, and particularly the interest from participants on organizations doing work relating to refugees. So I take some solace that there is a lot of interest in trying to do something on a very individual level. So thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I take one finger? I'm so sorry. You know, I just noticed somebody said this was depressing. It is depressing. My question to everyone is just going back to the, you know, why do we care? I hope the answer is that you feel that you have to care, because the human beings who are affected by this deserve the very, very basics, right? There should be a level of human rights under which people do not fall. And that's the world that we wish to live in.
Thank you
Yeah,
very
nicely
much,
said.
Annie.
Thank you, Annie. This was wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you, and have a good week, everybody.
Thanks.
So
And a
let
good
me-
holiday.
Okay,
right.
let me conclude us. So Annie, indeed, thank you very much. And I think that's a good, you gave us a resolution for the new year. So thank you for that. This is our last program. We begin again on February 10th at 10 a.m. We'll be joined by Sumit Ganguly, who is speaking on India's regional relations. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and director of the Huntington Program on Strengthening U.S.-India Relations. He holds many, many national and international awards, and he served on the faculties across the U.S. as well as internationally, UT Austin, Poe in Paris, U.S. Army War College, University of Heidelberg, Columbia University. He is also the Rabindranath Tagore Professor in India Cultures and Civilizations. He's the Emeritus Professor at the Indiana University in Bloomington. So please join us then. But in the meantime, have a wonderful holiday season and best wishes for a new year of wisdom and peace. We see you February 10th, 2025. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you again, Annie. It was just a wonderful presentation.